Keisha had been on her feet for 14 hours. Her arches throbbed inside cheap, non-slip sneakers, and the buzzing neon sign of the diner flickered against the headache pulsing behind her temples. Every time the door opened, her hand drifted to the pocket of her apron where her phone sat silent. No deposit notification, no miracle text from the landlord saying they could wait another week. Just the crushing reality of her mother's empty pill bottles at home and an eviction notice taped to their front door. When the bell chimed and the last customer walked in, Keisha swallowed her panic and forced a polite nod she didn't have the energy to fake. He didn't nod back. The man moved with a lethal grace, sliding into the back booth like a shadow seeking darker corners. He wasn't loud or rude. He was terrifyingly still. He looked less like a person and more like a statuesque warning, cold, immaculate, and dangerously out of place. Keisha served him anyway. She placed the coffee down gently so as not to disturb the silence. She left the check without making eye contact, sensing the violence coiling beneath his tailored suit. He didn't touch the coffee. He checked his watch, frowned, and then vanished out the door as quickly as he had arrived. Keisha exhaled a breath she didn't know she was holding. "Just get through the night," she whispered to the empty room. She walked to his table to wipe it down. That's when she saw it. A wallet, sleek black leather, sitting right where his hand had been. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she opened it. It was thick with cash. Hundreds, thousands, more money than she made in a year. Enough to save her mom, enough to save herself. But then she saw the ID card slotted in the front, and the cold realization hit her. The name wasn't just a name, it was a death sentence in this city. She wasn't holding a winning lottery ticket. She was holding the property of a monster. Outside the diner, Choi Jun-ho stood in the rain-slicked alley, unmoving. For 10 years, they called him the Silent Blade. He controlled the ports, the gambling dens, the loans that kept half the city indebted to him. His word was law, and his punishment was absolute. But tonight, standing in the dark, the empire felt like a house of cards. Troy leaned against the brick wall, watching the back exit of the diner through the downpour. He wasn't thinking about the money in the wallet. Money was just paper to him. He was thinking about the encryption drive tucked inside the hidden lining, the list of every corrupt judge and every traitor in his own organization who was planning to stick a knife in his back. He had been distracted tonight, his mind clouded by the realization that his lieutenant, his brother-in-arms, had sold him out. That distraction had cost him the wallet. In his world, a mistake like that was fatal. He reached for the silencer in his jacket, his eyes fixed on the diner door. He expected the waitress to keep it. Everyone kept it. In a city of thieves and liars, greed was the only constant. He expected her to pocket the cash and toss the drive. If she did, he would have to burn the whole place down to cover his tracks. But then the back door flew open. The waitress ran out into the rain, breathless, clutching the leather object like a lifeline. She wasn't running away. She was looking for him. Choi froze, his hand hovering over his weapon. She reminded him of something he thought he'd killed years ago: innocence. Tonight, Choi Jun-ho wasn't just a mafia boss looking for a lost item. He was a man who had lost his faith in humanity, about to be saved by the one person who had every reason to rob him blind. And neither of them knew that this act of return was about to start a war that would burn the city to the ground. The bell above the door didn't just chime when he entered. It seemed to toll. The midnight humidity followed him inside, but it died the second it hit the air conditioning, replaced by a sudden, artificial chill. Keisha was at the far end of the counter,
polishing the same spot on the laminate for the third time when she felt the shift. The low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sizzle of the grill felt suddenly too loud. Choi Jun-ho moved with the predatory stillness of a man who owned the ground he walked on. He didn't look at the menu, he didn't look at the wait to be seated sign. He simply drifted to the back corner booth, the one with the torn vinyl and the view of the rear exit. His suit was the color of a moonless night, tailored so sharply it looked like it could cut the air. In the kitchen, the cook stopped whistling. The dishwasher ducked his head. They knew who he was. Everyone in this district knew the silent blade, though few were brave enough to look him in the eye. Keisha's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she gripped her notepad until her knuckles turned ash gray. She needed this job. She needed the shifts. And more than that, she knew that in a place like this, the only thing more dangerous than a man like Choi was a man like Choi feeling disrespected. She stepped toward the booth, her non-slip shoes squeaking on the linoleum. As she approached, the air around him felt heavy, pressurized. He was staring out the window at the rain-slicked street, his profile as rigid and cold as a marble bust. He was waiting for a drop, a handoff that would likely decide the fate of a dozen men, but to the casual observer, he was just a lonely patron in a late-night diner. "Coffee, sir?" Keisha's voice was small, but she kept it steady. She didn't let it tremble, even as she felt his unreadable gaze pivot toward her. Choi didn't speak. He didn't even nod. He simply looked at her, a long, searching stare that felt like he was reading the fine print of her soul. His eyes were dark pits of calculated ice. "Black," he finally said.
The word was a low vibration, more felt than heard. Keisha poured the coffee, her hand steady by sheer force of will. She placed the mug down with a soft click, ensuring not a single drop splashed the saucer. She didn't linger. She didn't ask how his night was. She simply gave him the quiet he commanded, a silent pact of service and survival. As she walked away, she felt the weight of his presence at her back, a dark sun radiating a cold, terrifying heat. She went back to the counter, her eyes darting to the clock, praying for the dawn, unaware that the man in the corner was currently holding the keys to her destruction and her salvation. The bell chimed with a sharp, final clang as Jun-ho stepped out into the night. One moment he was a looming shadow in the corner booth, and the next he was gone, leaving behind nothing but the fading scent of expensive tobacco and a silence that felt heavier than his presence. Keisha stood behind the counter for a long beat, her lungs finally expanding as the pressure in the room dissipated. She grabbed her rag, moving toward the back booth to erase the traces of the man who had set the whole staff on edge. But as she reached the table, her breath hitched. The wallet sat right where his hand had been resting. It was black, made of leather so fine it looked like silk, and it felt warm when her fingers brushed against it. Her first instinct was to run to the door and call out, but her body wouldn't move. Her gaze fell to the slightly parted fold of the leather. Inside, she didn't just see paper. She saw a future. The stack of hundreds was so thick the wallet barely closed. It was a dense, intoxicating wedge of green that could change everything. She saw the face of her landlord, the one who had spent the morning screaming about the 3 months of back rent she owed. She saw the empty pharmacy bottles on her mother's nightstand, the ones they couldn't afford to refill, the ones that kept her mother's heart beating. The diner was a tomb of shadows. The cook was in the walk-in freezer. The dishwasher was out back. No one was looking. There were no cameras in this corner, only the flickering neon light from the street that turned the money a sickly, tempting shade of green. Just one bill, she thought, her heart hammering a frantic, guilty rhythm against her ribs. He wouldn't even miss one. It's a drop in the ocean for a man like him. But as she pulled the wallet closer, The leather shifted, revealing a small, silver-rimmed ID card and a heavy, metallic drive tucked into a hidden seam. The name Choi Jun-ho stared back at her. It wasn't just a wallet anymore. It was a piece of a life, a dangerous, dark life that she didn't belong to. She thought of her mother, who had worked 3 jobs to keep Keisha in school, who had taught her that the only thing a poor person truly owns is their name. If she took this, she wasn't just stealing money, she was selling the very thing her mother had struggled to preserve. The weight of the wallet felt like a lead weight in her palm. The temptation screamed in her ear, a choir of unpaid bills and looming homelessness. But then she looked at the door. Outside, the rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the world into gray. "Not like this," she whispered, the words a jagged prayer. She didn't stop to think again. She didn't count the money. She gripped the leather tight, ignored the burning in her feet, and bolted toward the back exit, pushing into the cold, wet night.
The cold rain slapped against Keisha's face the moment she burst through the heavy steel door. The alleyway was a canyon of wet brick and rotting cardboard, illuminated only by the sickly yellow spill of the diner's security light. Her breath came in ragged, white plumes. "Wait!" she cried out, her voice cracking against the downpour. "Stop! You forgot this!" At the far end of the alley, near the mouth of the street where a black sedan sat idling like a primal beast, the figure halted. Choi Jun-ho didn't turn around immediately. He stood, perfectly still, the rain cascading off his broad shoulders, his silhouette a jagged tear in the darkness. Keisha slowed to a halt a few yards away, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The realization of what she was doing, chasing a man whose name was whispered in fear across 3 precincts, finally caught up to her. Her sneakers were soaked, her uniform clung to her skin, and she was alone in the dark with a killer. Slowly, Choi turned. The yellow light caught the edge of his jaw, sharp as a razor. His expression wasn't one of gratitude. It was a mask of cold, lethal calculation. He looked at the wallet in her hand, then up at her face. The silence between them was pressurized, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. "You followed me," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to come from the ground itself. You left it," Keisha panted, stepping forward with her arm outstretched, her hand trembling violently. "On the table. I thought you'd need it." Troy didn't move to take it. Instead, he stepped into her space, his presence looming over her like a shadow. He reached out, his fingers brushing hers as he took the leather. His eyes never left hers as he flipped it open. He didn't look at the money first. He went straight for the hidden seam, his thumb sliding over the metallic edge of the encryption drive. Then, he did something she didn't expect. He counted the cash, not with the haste of a man who needed it, but with the clinical precision of a man looking for a reason to confirm his darkest suspicions about the world. He flicked through the hundreds, his eyes tracking the serial numbers. When he finished, he snapped the wallet shut. The sound was as loud as a gunshot in the narrow alley. "It's all here," he murmured, his voice laced with a strange, unsettling edge. "Every cent. Why? You look like you're starving. You look like you're one late payment away from the street." "I am," Keisha whispered, her dignity the only thing keeping her upright. "But it isn't mine." Choi stared at her for a long, agonizing beat. For the first time, the ice in his gaze seemed to flicker, cracked by a confusion he couldn't hide. He had spent his life surrounded by people who would kill for a fraction of what was in that wallet. Yet here stood a girl with nothing, giving it back for free. "Go back inside, Keisha Monroe," he said, using her name for the first time. It sounded like a warning and a promise all at once. The rain is turning cold. The black sedan didn't move for a long time after the diner's back door clicked shut. Inside the cabin, the only sound was the rhythmic, clinical tick of the engine cooling and the steady drum of rain against the reinforced glass. Choi Jun-ho sat in the darkness, the wallet resting on his thigh like a live coal. He didn't look at the money. He hadn't lied to her. He had expected it to be gone. In his world, the cash was nothing more than expensive bait, a test designed to see if the girl would crumble under the weight of her own desperation. He had watched her through the window, waiting for the moment she would tuck a few bills into her bra or slide the whole thing into the trash to be retrieved later. He had been prepared to treat her like a thief because thieves were easy to understand. They were predictable. But the drive, that was the heart of the matter. He reached into the hidden lining of the wallet and pulled out the slim, metallic keycard.
It was cold, heavy, and held enough encrypted data to dismantle his entire organization. This wasn't just property, it was a map of his vulnerabilities. He stared at it, the green light from the dashboard reflecting in his eyes. He had been distracted at the table, his mind racing with the report he'd received an hour earlier, a leak from within the inner circle. A cold realization began to settle in his gut, sharper than any blade. He hadn't simply forgotten the wallet. He was a man of meticulous, almost obsessive habits. To leave his most sensitive asset sitting on a grease-stained table wasn't a lapse in memory, it was a lapse in soul. He was slipping. He was tired of the shadows, tired of looking for a knife in every handshake. Worse, he realized the leak wasn't just a rumor. The very fact that he had been followed tonight, that he felt the prickle of eyes on the back of his neck even now, meant the hunters were already closing in. If Keisha hadn't run out into the rain, if she had kept that wallet even 10 minutes longer, his enemies would have tracked the signal in the card straight to her. They would have killed her just to see what she knew. He looked at the diner door, the warm yellow light spilling out onto the wet pavement. She had returned his life to him without asking for a single thing in return, unaware that she had just painted a target on her own back. He shifted the car into gear, the tires hissing against the asphalt as he pulled away. He had come to the diner to find a traitor, but he had found something far more dangerous, a reason to care about someone who had no place in his war. His enemies were closer than he thought, but for the first time in a decade, Choi Jun-ho wasn't just fighting for power. He was fighting to ensure that the only honest person he'd ever met didn't pay the price for his sins.
The tires of the black sedan had barely begun to roll when the world outside the diner turned blindingly bright. High beams, cold and aggressive, cut through the rain and the gloom, pinning Choi's car like a moth to a board. Two heavy, matte-black SUVs roared from the shadows of the neighboring warehouse, swerving with screeching tires to block the diner's entrance in a perfect, military-grade pincer movement. Choi's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning a ghostly white. He didn't need to see the crests on the doors to know who they were. His rivals, the ones who had been whispering in the dark, hungry for the drive in his pocket, hadn't waited for him to reach his stronghold. They had tracked the signal to the one place where he was most vulnerable, the place where he had allowed himself a moment of uncharacteristic hesitation. He looked at the diner's front window. Through the glass, he saw Keisha's silhouette. She was frozen, her hand hovering over a stack of napkins, her wide eyes reflecting the harsh glare of the SUV's lights. She didn't understand yet, but the terror was already beginning to seep into her posture. To them, she wasn't a girl who had done the right thing. She was a witness. She was an obstacle. She was leverage. The SUV doors flung open in unison. Men in dark tactical gear stepped out, the rain slicking their heavy coats as they raised their weapons. They weren't there to negotiate. In the hierarchy of the streets, when you find the king outside his castle, you don't talk, you strike. Choi looked at the alleyway behind him, the clear path to escape. He could disappear into the maze of the city, find his own soldiers and fight this war on his terms. But as a heavy boot kicked the diner's front door, the glass spiderwebbing with a sickening crack, he saw Keisha stumble backward, her hands flying to her mouth in a silent scream.
He realized then that the silent blade had made a fatal error. He had left his heart behind in a cracked vinyl booth. With a low, guttural snarl, Choi didn't shift into reverse. Instead, he slammed the sedan into park and reached for the heavy iron hidden beneath his seat. The engine hummed, a low growl of defiance against the storm. He had spent a lifetime building an empire of fear, but as he stepped out into the rain to face the line of fire, he knew he was no longer fighting for a throne. He was fighting for the girl who had returned his wallet, and in doing so, had returned his soul. The siege had begun, and the diner was about to become a sanctuary or a tomb. The heavy glass of the front door didn't just break, it exploded inward as a combat boot shattered the frame. Rain and shards of glass sprayed across the linoleum, glistening like diamonds in the harsh, oppressive glare of the SUV headlights. "Check the back! No witnesses!" a voice barked from the storm outside. The command was cold, devoid of mercy. Through the shattered portal, Keisha saw a man in a dark tactical vest tossing a heavy glass bottle. It hit the floor near the counter, the smell of gasoline instantly choking the air as a small, hungry flame began to lick at the grease-stained floor. They weren't just here for the drive anymore. They were here to erase the evidence of their failure by turning the diner into a funeral pyre. Keisha let out a sharp, choked sob, her knees buckling as she scrambled backward toward the kitchen. "Oh God! Oh God!" Before she could collapse, a hand, firm, steady, and warm, latched onto her arm. Choi Jun-ho was there. He didn't look like the man who had sat silently over a cold cup of coffee. He looked like a storm given human form. With one fluid motion, he pulled her upright and shoved her toward the narrow space behind the heavy steel prep table.
"Get down," he commanded. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order that brooked no argument. Troy moved to the front door, his silhouette framed by the fire growing behind him. He reached out and slammed the heavy deadbolt home on what remained of the doorframe, then did the same for the service entrance. He was locking them in, turning the diner into a cage, but a cage that he controlled. "They're gonna burn us alive," Keisha whispered, her voice trembling as she watched the fire spread toward the wooden booths. Troy didn't look back. He drew a heavy, matte black handgun from beneath his jacket, the metal catching the orange glow of the rising flames. He stood in the center of the aisle, perfectly poised between the fire at the front and the killers at the back, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the floor. "They are going to try," Choi said, his voice a low, terrifying calm that somehow cut through the roar of the fire and the shouting outside. He glanced over his shoulder, his dark eyes meeting hers for a fraction of a second. In that gaze, the silent blade vanished, replaced by a man who was finally, desperately, making a choice. "Stay behind me, Keisha. Do not move. Do not look away." Outside, the first volley of gunfire erupted, the bullets punching neat, rhythmic holes through the thin walls of the diner. Keisha curled into a ball, pressing her head to the cold floor, but above her, Choi didn't flinch. He was the shield between her and the end of the world. He was a monster fighting other monsters, and for the first time in her life, Keisha realized that the most dangerous man in the room was the only thing keeping her heart beating. The air in the diner turned to glass and fire. As the first wave of gunmen kicked through the skeletal remains of the door, Choi Jun-ho moved with a fluidity that defied the chaos. He didn't just fight, he operated. He was a shadow cutting through the orange haze of the growing flames, his movements precise, economical, and terrifyingly final. A gunman lunged through the smoke, the muzzle of his rifle seeking a target. Choi didn't wait. He closed the distance in a heartbeat, his hand catching the barrel and wrenching it upward as the ceiling fan above them was shredded by a stray burst of lead. With a sickeningly rhythmic strike, Choi's elbow connected with the man's temple, dropping him like a stone. Before the second man could clear the threshold, Choi's weapon barked twice, sharp, clinical cracks that echoed against the tile. Keisha pressed her face into her sleeves, the heat from the burning booths singing the hair on her arms. Every time she dared to look up, she saw Choi positioned like an iron gate between her and the encroaching death. He was a human shield, shifting his weight to lead the fire away from the prep table where she crouched. He took a graze to the shoulder, the dark fabric of his suit tearing to reveal a bloom of crimson, but he didn't so much as flinch. His focus was absolute, a predator protecting the only thing in the world that felt real. The diner was a symphony of destruction. Plates shattered into porcelain shrapnel. The coffee urn hissed as it was pierced by a bullet, sending a cloud of steam into the smoke. Choi used the environment like a weapon, kicking a heavy oak table onto its side to provide a momentary barricade, his eyes constantly darting back to ensure Keisha was still low, still breathing. One of the rivals, a massive man with a jagged scar across his throat, managed to flank the counter, swinging a heavy iron pipe.
Choi caught the blow on his forearm, the sound of bone meeting metal a dull thud, and countered with a strike so fast Keisha barely saw it. He drove the man back into the wall of fire, his expression never shifting from that mask of icy resolve. "Stay down!" Choi shouted over the roar of the flames, his voice a guttural command that anchored her in the madness. He was the silent blade, and tonight his edge was honed by something more than just survival. For every bullet he fired and every blow he landed, he was carving out a small, desperate space for a girl who had shown him a kindness he didn't deserve. The diner was crumbling around them, the roof groaning under the heat, but as long as Choi stood, the threshold remained uncrossed. He was the monster in the dark, and for the first time, he was fighting for the light. The roar of the fire was beginning to swallow the sound of the storm, a hungry, crackling beast that turned the diner into a skeleton of glowing embers. Then a new sound pierced the haze, the low, mournful wail of sirens, distant but drawing closer by the second. Blue and red pulses began to flicker against the thick smoke, painting the raindrops like falling sparks. The pressure in the room shifted instantly. The gunmen outside, realizing their window of opportunity had closed, scrambled back into the darkness. Tires screeched as the heavy SUVs roared away, fleeing the approaching law. Choi Jun-ho stood in the center of the wreckage, his chest heaving, his dark suit tattered and slick with a mixture of rain, soot, and blood. He lowered his weapon, the tension in his shoulders finally snapping. He didn't look at the door. He didn't look at the fire. He turned his head toward the steel prep table. "It's over," he said. His voice was no longer a command. It was a rough, gravelly rasp, barely audible over the crackle of burning wood. Keisha crawled out from her hiding spot, her hands black with ash, her uniform torn. She looked around at the place she had spent so many long, exhausting hours. It was a ruin. The booths were charred husks. The counter where she'd served coffee was splintered by lead. She looked at Choi, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a profound, confusing gratitude. She wanted to say something, to thank him, to scream, to ask him why, but the words died in her throat. Choi stepped toward her, stopping just out of reach. For a fleeting second, his cold mask slipped, and she saw the man beneath the legend, a man who was profoundly alone, bleeding from a wound he refused to acknowledge. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small metallic encryption drive, the reason for all this blood. He looked at it for a moment, then back at Keisha. "The police will be here in less than a minute," he murmured. Tell them you hid. Tell them you didn't see faces. If you speak my name, they cannot protect you. Only I can do that." He reached out, his fingers hovering near her shoulder as if he meant to comfort her, but he pulled back at the last moment, as if his touch might stain her. "You have a brave heart, Keisha Monroe. Do not let this city break it." Before she could blink, he was moving. He faded into the shadows of the kitchen, slipping through the back exit just as the first police cruiser skidded into the parking lot. By the time the officers burst through the shattered front door with flashlights cutting through the smoke, the silent blade was gone. Keisha sat on the soot-covered floor, trembling in the cold draft, staring at the spot where he had stood. He had left her with nothing but her life, yet as the sirens drowned out the world, she realized she was no longer the same girl who had found a wallet an hour ago. She was a survivor, and she was no longer invisible.
The seasons turned, and the scorched scent of smoke eventually faded from the corner of 4th and Main, replaced by the crisp, biting air of a new winter. For 6 months, Keisha Monroe lived in the quiet after the storm. The police reports had labeled the incident a gang-related firebombing. Her mother had miraculously recovered thanks to an anonymous donor who covered the costs of her treatment in full, and the diner had stood as a hollow, boarded-up shell, a skeleton of a life Keisha thought she had lost. She was working a temporary retail job, still barely scraping by, when a courier arrived at her small apartment. He was a man in a crisp suit who didn't look like a delivery driver. He handed her a thick, cream-colored envelope without a word and waited while she opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a stack of legal documents, heavy and official. Her eyes blurred as she read the terms: a full transfer of property, a paid-in-full tax lien, and a business license. The diner didn't belong to a faceless corporation anymore. It belonged to her. The building had been completely renovated, new wiring, reinforced glass, and plush midnight blue booths that replaced the cracked vinyl of her past. At the bottom of the stack was a small, hand-cut piece of cardstock. The handwriting was precise, slanted, and bold. "Honesty is rare. It should be rewarded." There was no signature, but she didn't need one. She could almost smell the expensive tobacco and the ozone of the rain. She could almost feel the weight of the silent blade standing at her back, a shadow that no longer felt like a threat, but like a shield. A week later, Keisha stood in the center of the newly reopened diner. The neon sign outside hummed with a steady, reliable glow, no longer flickering with the threat of going out. The kitchen was alive with the sound of a whistling cook and the clatter of fresh porcelain. As the clock struck midnight, the bell above the door chimed, a clear bell-like tone that echoed through the warm room. A man in a dark, tailored suit walked in. He didn't head for the back booth this time. He sat at the counter, right in the center of the light. He looked less like a weapon and more like a man who had finally put one down. Keisha walked over, her stride confident, her spirit no longer crushed by the weight of survival. She didn't offer a nervous smile or a shaky hand. She simply poured a cup of coffee, black and steaming, and set it down with a soft, certain click. "On the house," she said softly. Choi Jun-ho looked up, and for the first time the ice in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, profound respect. He didn't speak, but he didn't have to. In the silence of the diner, between a woman who had kept her soul and a man who had found his, a debt had been repaid in full. They were no longer the waitress and the boss. They were two people who had looked into the darkness and decided to keep the light. Your integrity is something you can never afford to lose. What would you have done if you found that wallet? Let us know in the comments below. And be sure to subscribe for more unforgettable stories that remind us that doing the right thing is the only currency that truly matters.